July 12, 1943. The train squealed as its heavy wheels scraped against the warm tracks, sparks flying in the bright midday sun. Dust kicked up from the Texas plains, clinging to the sweaty faces of the soldiers packed inside the train car. They'd been told they were headed for shame, maybe punishment, or even hunger. Some whispered that America would treat them like animals, not worthy of respect. But when the brakes hissed and the train jerked to a stop, what they saw first wasn't cold concrete walls or scary guard towers with guns. It was a man. He leaned against a wooden post, one boot resting easy on the fence, a wide hat shading his eyes. His shiny spurs gleamed in the hot sun. The German prisoners pushed against the dirty, barred windows, staring in surprise. One whispered a word that mixed wonder and teasing: cowboy. He'd seen them before, but only in American movies snuck into Germany before the war. For most of these men, Hollywood was like a dream, as unreal as a fairy tale. Yet here this cowboy stood, real as the dusty ground, under a huge sky that seemed to laugh at their imprisonment. As the train doors banged open, warm air rushed in, smelling of wild plants, cows, and dirt. It wasn't the stink of war, but the scent of life, tough and alive. The prisoners stepped out, squinting in the bright light, tired but not chained. Their boots sank into the soft earth, so different from the hard streets of Munich, Dresden, or Cologne. They expected shouts, guns poking their sides, or harsh orders. Instead, the guards, mostly farmers turned soldiers, watched them with calm patience. And there, among them, stood more men in big hats and sturdy boots. Americans who looked less like soldiers of a big country and more like heroes from adventure books. One prisoner, Hans, later wrote in his journal, "I thought we'd stepped into a movie. Horses were eating grass past the fence, and the men guarding us acted not like enemies, but like farmers watching their animals. Only now we were the animals." The thought stung. These were men who had fought in Fritz's desert army, who had stood in the sands of North Africa, who had believed in Germany's greatness. Yet here, without their guns or pride, they faced Americans whose strength wasn't just in their rifles, but in their way of living, relaxed, sure of themselves, shaped by wide-open lands. To the Germans, used to strict rules and loud commands, the cowboys' easy stance and quiet confidence felt like a new kind of power. A sergeant shouted for them to line up, but even as they followed orders, many kept staring at the horizon. There were no tall walls or endless rows of barbed wire, just the open plains, grass waving in the breeze, and the faint shapes of cows far away. They felt a strange worry. This was captivity, sure, but it also felt like a kind of freedom they'd never known under Germany's strict control. As they marched toward the camp, they saw the barbed wire fence, simple, almost weak compared to what they imagined. The wooden towers stood, but no one was in them, their ladders empty. The guards walked casually, not like soldiers. Some even nodded their hats to the townsfolk who had come to watch. Ladies in sun hats stood under the hot sun, murmuring about young German men the same age as their sons fighting far away, painted a mix of strange opposites. Enemies faced friendly looks, victors became a show to watch. Inside the camp stretched out more like a ranch than a prison. Tall wooden huts stood in neat lines, a food hall in the center, and wide fields ahead where prisoners would soon labor. The first shock hit when food smells drifted their way, beef stew bubbling, the bold scent of coffee brewing. For many, this felt cruel in a new way. They'd been told America would starve them, yet the air carried richness instead. One soldier, Hans, whispered sadly, "My mom hasn't had beef in 3 years." The cowboy, who first caught their eyes, still lounged by the fence, as if their surprise amused him. He chewed a grass blade, spat into the ground, and gave a small nod as they passed. That quiet act stung more than a shout. It wasn't bragging, but a calm confidence, showing he wasn't shaken by their past power. The Germans were guided to their huts, but even inside, chatter hummed about what they'd seen. Some thought it a trick, a way to soften them before harshness hit. Others murmured about possibilities, jobs, meals, perhaps even honor. One young officer, Klaus, only 22, sat on his bunk and mumbled, If this is capture, it's not what I pictured. Outside, farm sounds slipped into the camp. A dog barked, a horse neighed, cows mooed softly. The prisoners lay on their beds, torn between relief and guilt. They had marched to expand their nation. Yet here, fed and guarded by men who felt like tales, not troops. The cowboy was real, flesh, dust, and leather, living freer by the fence than they ever did in Europe's armies. Night fell quick like in a desert. The horizon glowed with the last sun rays, and prisoners peeked through wall cracks. The same cowboy stood by a lantern, its light tracing his hat. A mouth organ played from afar, a tune the Germans didn't know but felt in their hearts. For the first time since capture, silence held not just sadness, but new questions. The day began with firm beliefs. Capture meant mistreatment. By night's end, doubt took over. Was this place of cows, coffee, and cowboys really their jail? Or was it, in some strange twist, a peek at a freedom they'd never had back home? That night, by the faint glow of a hidden candle, one prisoner, Hans, wrote in his journal words that would linger long after the war. I'm not as scared of the barbed wire as I am of the open land beyond it. For the first time, I wonder if we've been the ones trapped all along. The first morning started with a loud whistle, sharp and clear, slicing through the quiet buzz of the plains. It woke the Germans with a start. They got up slowly from their beds, expecting thin soup or hard bread, the kind of meager food they'd heard about on the ship. But when they walked into the dining hall, they froze. Long wooden tables held steaming bowls of beef stew, piles of cornbread on metal trays, and jugs of hot black coffee that filled the air with its strong smell. It wasn't fancy, not by American standards, but to men who'd marched with empty bellies in North Africa or lived on stale bread in Europe, it was too much. Some stood still, wondering if it was a trick. A guard, his hat pushed back, waved them forward with a simple hand motion. "Eat," he said, like it was no big deal. One prisoner, Klaus, picked up his spoon, tasted the stew, and shut his eyes. The beef was soft and warm on his tongue. Another bit into the cornbread and let out a soft laugh. It was sweet, softer than any bread he'd had at home. He whispered, almost guilty, "My family hasn't seen real flour in years." The others nodded, eating quietly. Every bite reminded them that their families in Germany were hungry while they, the prisoners, ate like they were on a trip. News spread fast. Letters home, checked by guards but still full of hints, told of the plenty. A camp report from 1944 quoted one prisoner writing, "Mama, don't worry about me. I eat more meat here than when I was a kid." Another mentioned the endless coffee, a drink only rich people had in Germany, now served in scratched mugs without limits. Some guards laughed at the prisoner's surprise, saying the food wasn't even special. It was just what any American farmer might eat on a regular day. The barbed wire stood outside, but inside the camp, the ways of ranch life started to sink in. After breakfast, prisoners were let out, not for harsh drills, but for work tasks. Picking cotton, fixing fences, tending crops, or unloading hay bales on nearby farms. Under the Geneva Convention, they could do non-military jobs. And in these farming states, their help was badly needed. With American men away at war, the farms were short of workers. Now the enemy carried water buckets, hauled sacks of grain, and guided plows behind horses. At first, they complained. Many prisoners thought farm work was too low for soldiers like them. Some tried to push back, hoping for fights that would show their captors' cruelty. But the guards rarely shouted. They pointed, showed how to do things, and sometimes even helped. One cowboy, sweat rolling from under his hat, taught a young German, Klaus, how to lift a hay bale without hurting his back. Klaus, feeling shy, copied him. Later, in the barracks, he admitted he'd never seen a leader help instead of just giving orders. Pay was another surprise. Each man got credits, about 80 cents a day, for his work. They could use it at the camp store for soap, paper, or even treats like chocolate or cigarettes. For men taught to expect hunger, this felt strange. A German corporal, Hans, once said with a bitter laugh, "I fought for my country and got nothing. I picked cotton for a cowboy, and I'm paid." The differences grew. On Sundays, local farmers who hired prisoners sometimes shared lemonade, cookies, or a seat on their porch. One old Texan remembered years later how a young German helped him fix a fence, then sat quietly on the steps, staring at the wide land. When asked what he was thinking, the prisoner said, "I've never seen a place so big it never ends." His voice held wonder, not anger, but the plenty caused new problems. In the barracks, some men felt uneasy. They worried they were getting soft, charmed by food and kindness, losing their loyalty to Germany. Others whispered that the Americans had no right to treat them so well. It was a shame worse than beatings. A few held tight to old beliefs, mocking prisoners who laughed during work or enjoyed American food. Tension grew, splitting men between those who held on to old pride and those who started to wonder what strength really was. In official reports, American officers noticed these splits. Some camps separated the stubborn ones, worried they'd scare others. But in daily life, things mixed. A man could arrive thinking he was better than everyone, then a week later hum cowboy tunes he heard from guards, tapping his foot while eating cornbread with another mug of coffee. The details stuck in their minds. The squeak of saddle leather as guards rode by the fences, the sizzle of cornbread batter on a hot pan, the smell of fresh hay floating through open barrack windows. These things belonged to free men, not prisoners. Yet here the Germans were, living among them, experiencing America not as winners or visitors, but as unwilling guests who still found themselves changed. One prisoner, Hans, later wrote in a book, "We were scared of beatings, but none came. Instead, they gave us bread so soft it made us feel bad. They poured coffee until we couldn't drink more. They paid us to work their fields. Their kindness didn't comfort me. It confused me." His words showed the heart of their struggle. How could an enemy be kind when their own leaders were harsh? Yet even in this puzzle, funny moments slipped in. A Texas guard remembered teaching a German officer, Klaus, how to rope a calf during a break. Klaus tried, missed, tried again, and ended up tangled in his own rope while the Americans laughed loudly. The guard later joked, "That was the only German officer I saw give up twice in one day." For the prisoners, laughter was both embarrassing and freeing, a sign that the world they were taught to hate was not just stronger, but freer in spirit. By fall, the camp's routine felt normal. Work, meals, letters home, and sometimes watching baseball games through the fence. But deep down, the shock of plenty still stung. They ate beef while their families had only potatoes. They drank endless coffee while their mothers and wives waited in ration lines. Each bite was both a gift and a hurt. One evening, after a long day moving hay, a group of Germans stood by the fence as the sun dropped over the plains. Beyond the wire, a cowboy lit a lantern, its light showing his weathered face. He tipped his hat and walked off, leaving only the chirp of crickets and the far-off sound of cows. One prisoner whispered, "He works harder than us, but he's free. Why do they treat us better than our own leaders?" The question hung in the warm night air. The men went back to their barracks, quiet and uneasy. They were full of bread and beef, but empty of answers. As the lights went out, many wondered if the real prison was the fence around them or the beliefs they brought from home. The days grew longer, not boring, but full of strange new things. Inside the barbed wire, life started to feel almost normal, almost too normal. The Germans expected to suffer, but instead found chances they never had back home. The barracks, smelling of hay and soap, soon filled with the sound of pencils scratching, books shuffling, and quiet lessons. America, it turned out, was ready to teach its prisoners. Classes started in the dusty camp halls. School teachers led English lessons, farmers who were also guards taught woodworking, and even prisoners gave talks on math and history. Some men bent over desks, practicing simple English words. Others hammered rough chairs or carved little figures from pine, the smell of wood shavings sticking to their clothes. At night, the barracks glowed softly with lantern light as men wrote new words in notebooks, whispering, "Hello, coffee, cowboy," testing the sounds on their lips. It was a freedom they didn't expect. Inside the fence, their world grew bigger. One prisoner, Hans, later wrote, "I learned more in 1 year as a prisoner than in all the years of speeches back home." The irony stung. Behind barbed wire, watched by so-called enemies, they found room to think. Music filled the nights, too. Germans who had hidden harmonicas in their bags started playing. First sad songs from home, then bravely American cowboy tunes they overheard. Soon camp bands formed. Violins hummed, accordions squeaked, and the sounds of ranch life mixed with the music of the defeated. Guards sometimes stopped to listen, tipping their hats quietly before moving on. For the prisoners, it was strange how easily they could copy the music of a culture they were taught to hate. The differences grew every week. Newspapers appeared, made on simple machines, filled with stories, jokes, and even opinions. Some had debates about politics. Others held poems written in neat German handwriting. By 1945, over 400 camp newspapers spread across America, each one a voice for men who, even as prisoners, wouldn't stay quiet. In one camp, a piece asked boldly, "Why talk of being better when the cowboy feeds us and we can't feed ourselves?" Back home, those words might have been dangerous. Here, they were written in ink and stuck on a board. Outside the wire, work went on. Prisoners cut wheat under Nebraska's wide sky, picked cotton in Oklahoma's heat, and marked cattle while ranchers watched, offering water when the sun got too hot. The smell of burnt leather, the sizzle of branding irons, the dust in their mouths. It all became part of their days. Some felt proud of their work, showing off rough hands to prove they were more than prisoners, but men who could still do good. One guard remembered a moment that stuck with him. A young German, Klaus, thin and tired, wiped sweat off his face after stacking hay bales. The rancher whose field he worked on held out a hand and said, "Good work." Klaus froze. In Germany, no farmer would thank a soldier. Leaders demanded, orders followed, not thanks given. But here was a cowboy, dusty and red from the sun, treating him like an equal. Klaus shook the hand slowly at first, then firmly. That night, he told a bunkmate that the handshake shook him more than losing a battle. But not everyone liked this new way. Some grew cold, mocking friends who smiled at guards or learned English words. They called them betrayers, men tricked by the enemy's kindness. Tensions grew. In some camps, loyalists tried to rule the barracks, scaring others into silence, reminding them of their promises to their country. American leaders noticed. Reports said they had to split up the stubborn ones from those just trying to get by. The barbed wire held not just prisoners, but their struggles, old loyalties fighting new thoughts. The cowboy presence stood out, a quiet hint of a different way to live. The prisoners watched their guards play cards by lantern light, laugh easily, spit tobacco into the dirt, and ride horses with natural skill. Authority here wasn't shouted in orders but shone in the tilt of a hat or a slow, calm word. To the Germans, raised under strict rules, this was confusing. How could order exist without fear? How could men earn respect without yelling? One night, Hans wrote in his journal about a moment. After work, he walked near the fence, watching a cowboy lead his horse to the stable. The guard hummed, pausing to pat the horse's neck, talking softly to it. Hans wrote, "I saw more kindness in his hand on that horse than in 1,000 salutes to my leaders. It showed me authority can come from care, not fear." Humor helped too. In one camp, prisoners played soccer inside the fence while guards cheered outside. A ball flew too far, and a cowboy kicked it back with surprising talent. The Germans laughed, clapping jokingly. The guard tipped his hat, smiling. It was strange, enemies sharing a game with only barbed wire between them. Yet in that odd moment, a truth shone through. Kindness crossed even the toughest barriers. The struggle grew sharper. Was this kindness real or a trick? Could men taught to value cruelty accept respect from those they called enemies? Every meal, handshake, and song pushed the question deeper. Some held tight to old pride, resisting. Others quietly wondered if they'd been wrong all along. To outsiders, the camp's routine might seem normal: work, meals, rest. But for the prisoners, each day broke down old beliefs. Barbed wire kept them in, but ideas moved freely. They argued, studied, played, and slowly a new idea of freedom sank into their hearts. As winter came to the plains, nights grew long and cold. Prisoners huddled in their bunks, blankets wrapped tight, breath puffing in the icy air. Outside, lanterns glowed, and cowboys walked slowly, their spurs clicking on frozen ground. Through the thin walls, the Germans heard a harmonica's soft, lonely tune floating across the camp. Some closed their eyes and let it soothe them. Others stayed awake, uneasy, realizing captivity had given them something more dangerous than cruelty. A taste of freedom they couldn't forget. In the quiet before sleep, one whispered question passed from bunk to bunk, too scary to say loudly. If this is how America treats its prisoners, how much freer are its people? The war ended quietly in the camps, not with a bang. In spring 1945, whispers spread through the barracks. Germany had given up. Their country was broken. Their leader was gone. The men sat stunned on their bunks, staring at their boots, their hands, the wooden floor. Some cried softly. Others clenched their fists, unable to picture a world without the system that had shaped their lives. Outside the wire, the cowboys kept on as always, feeding cows, drinking coffee, fixing saddles before the sun rose. For the prisoners, their homeland's collapse clashed painfully with the steady beat of ranch life around them. Their country had promised strength but brought ruin. The cowboy promised nothing, yet he kept going. Trains lined up again to take the defeated back across the ocean. Many prisoners felt glad to go home, but also a quiet sadness they couldn't explain. They came to America thinking it was cruel, weak, and worse than their nation. Now they left with mixed feelings, their bellies full of cornbread, their ears humming with cowboy songs, and their hearts holding memories of a freedom they'd never known before the war. Letters from those final weeks show their confusion. One soldier, Hans, wrote to his mother, "I'm coming back different. The Americans didn't hit me. They shook my hand. They didn't starve me. They gave me bread until I felt bad eating it. They didn't shame me. They let me work, paid me, and treated me like I was still a man." Another, Klaus, wrote about the cowboys. "They work harder than us, but they're freer. Their strength comes from respect, not fear. I think of them a lot. Small moments changed them deeply. A handshake after stacking hay all day. A slice of watermelon shared in the August heat. A harmonica's tune floating over the fence on the prairie breeze. For some, it was the sound of boots on a porch, spurs jingling like tiny bells. For others, it was a cowboy tipping his hat without pride. A simple act that stuck in their minds like a thorn. The Americans didn't try to change them. The cowboy wasn't preaching or pushing ideas. He was just himself. His calm, his ease, his respect were enough. The prisoners started telling stories about him, half joking, half in awe. They said he didn't fear leaders because he didn't bow to anyone. They said his land was so big he could never be trapped. They said his strength wasn't just in his body, but in the quiet way he faced the open land, like nothing could break him. These weren't lessons from rule books. They were feelings that sank in quietly, changing how the Germans saw America and themselves. When they returned to Europe, many carried these thoughts like hidden treasures. Post-war Germany was full of broken buildings, food ration cards, and cold winters. But in their minds, they still saw wheat fields under Nebraska's sun, smelled the strong coffee in tin mugs, and pictured men who worked hard without being mean. Some tried to bring bits of that life back. In the 1950s, cowboy clubs started in West Germany, where men wore hats, played guitars, and dreamed of the plains they'd seen through barbed wire. A few even gave their farms English names, quietly honoring the land that held them captive but gave them respect. Historians who read their letters and stories agree. The cowboys left a mark deeper than anyone knew then. Not every German gave up old beliefs or loved America's ways, but seeds were planted, doubts about the lies they'd been told, and admiration for a life that felt both strange and worth envying. Years later, one former prisoner, Hans, shared, "I came to America as an enemy. I left not as a friend, maybe, but with respect. The cowboy taught me more about freedom than any leader. The Americans didn't think much of it. For them, it was just right. Follow the rules, feed the men, let them work, keep things peaceful." But without knowing, they showed something deeper. Power doesn't have to hurt. Strength can be quiet. and freedom can live in the daily life of a rancher who tips his hat and carries his tools. For the prisoners, this kindness brought not just thanks, but shame. They knew their families suffered from bombs, hunger, and fear while they ate beef stew and played soccer behind fences. This guilt stayed heavy in their hearts. Some admitted they were scared to go home, afraid to tell how well they lived with the enemy. One man, Klaus, said plainly, "We lived better as prisoners than our people did as free." What does that say about us? That question wasn't easy to answer. It weighed on them as they boarded trains again, the wheels carrying them east, the land of cowboys fading behind. At the docks, they looked back toward the horizon where they first arrived years ago. Some carried books they studied in camp. Others held small horse carvings made from wood scraps. Many had only memories, but all carried the question of what freedom really meant and why they only felt it in defeat. Through train windows, the prisoners watched America's countryside pass one last time. Golden fields ready for harvest, cows grazing slowly, small towns with white church steeples. A boy waved at the train, not knowing the men inside were the enemy his dad fought. A cowboy on horseback appeared for a moment, outlined against the sky, then disappeared into the dust. The prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, trying to hold the picture forever. Years later, in stories and books, many still talked about that image. Not battlefields or broken cities, but a cowboy leaning on a fence, spurs shining in the sun. The memory brought both comfort and unease, a reminder their war ended not in cruelty, but in a quiet lesson they never expected. The story lives on, not in numbers or agreements, but in the strange truth of men who found freedom while trapped. They met America not through big speeches or tricks, but through the dust, sweat, and quiet respect of cowboys. It's a story of enemies softened not by bullets, but by bread, coffee, and handshakes given across the divide of war. The trains rolled east, but the memory stayed, held in the hearts of men who once thought they'd rule the world. They met their captors in boots and hats and could never forget them. And in that lasting image was one final question. If the cowboy was real, what else about America was true?